It's time to rehabilitate the term independent scholar. We should stop thinking of this term, thinking perhaps silently to ourselves, but thinking nonetheless, as a mark of shame or failure, reserved for those who couldn't make it in academia. Instead, I think we should view the term independent scholar as a mark of courage and dedication to intellectual life, a term given to those who have chosen to blaze their own trails outside contemporary institutions of higher education. Several years ago, I had the dawning realization that I urgently needed to start making alternative career plans. After a decade spent completing 2 master's degrees, a PhD, and a postdoc, it had become clear to me that my journey through academia was almost certainly at an end. Like many others, I had published articles in prestigious journals, won a teaching award, successfully taught hundreds of undergraduate students at multiple universities, and received the acclamation of my dissertation advisor and committee. I realized at some point that none of this mattered. It wasn't just that the jobs were too few and far between. Even if I miraculously landed a job, reports from former colleagues and others suggested that being a professor might not entail what I had imagined it would. There are also bigger changes on the horizon in the university system, which I'll talk about later. Those changes made staying in academia seem like a dead end. I should also add that I'm divorced and I have 2 kids. So for me, staying in academia would also have meant being willing to move away from family. And I just didn't feel that was something I could do. So I found new work in a new industry, even as I have maintained a sense of vocation as a scholar. I'll talk about what I do for money some other time. In this video, I want to set up a number of interrelated topics that I will cover over the course of several videos. In this first video, I'll talk about what I mean by the term independent scholar. After that, I'll talk about 3 types of independence which the independent scholar cultivates. Those are institutional independence, intellectual independence, and financial independence. Regarding the last topic, I want to note in advance, many academics are not trained to think well about money. For some of us, this can be an obstacle to separating from the university system. I think it's important to explain why money doesn't have to be an obstacle to becoming an independent scholar. So for the topic of this video, what is an independent scholar? In order to explain what I mean, I'll tell a bit more of my own story. I went into academia because I was interested in living a life dedicated to ideas, to meaningful conversations and rich intellectual friendships, to hard but rewarding work as a teacher, and to scholarship that I cared about. But as I went on the job market several years ago, it became increasingly clear to me that getting a job meant, in a significant number of cases, being overworked and underpaid, alienated from colleagues, caught up in bureaucratic red tape, and teaching required courses that might not be of particular interest to me or my students. Realizing that the ideals and values which got me into academia weren't going to materialize at many university positions, those same values led me out of academia. It wasn't that my values or sense of vocation changed, quite the opposite. My desire to pursue the life of the mind has only acquired new depth and clarity as I have proceeded. What has changed is not my sense of vocation, but the possibility of pursuing that vocation within the set of institutions that we call academia. I've seen a few post-academics like myself write blogs or post videos about how to get a tech job with a PhD in humanities or some other similar position. This is undoubtedly an important topic, and I've benefited from this kind of content. But I would like to hear more discussion of what it means to continue to be an intellectual after acquiring a position in a new industry. I have found myself looking for a way to name my ongoing sense of vocation as an intellectual, but few conversation partners for what I have in mind. There are any number of terms one might choose, but I landed on the term independent scholar. Perhaps I can explain the idea of an independent scholar by distinguishing the term from several other terms which do not capture what I have in mind. The first term is public intellectual. Public intellectuals communicate scholarly ideas to a broad, non-scholarly audience. One might think of figures such as Cornel West or Noam Chomsky. In the world of YouTube and podcasts, Andrew Huberman and Jordan Peterson are good examples. It is possible to be both an independent scholar and a public intellectual. It is also possible to be one without being the other. One might be a public intellectual without being an independent scholar in my sense. One can also be an independent scholar without being a public intellectual. I would suggest there is some amount of tension between the two, to the extent that an independent scholar might be interested in cultivating a way of life that does not sit easily with public recognition. The second term is scholar-practitioner. This term seems to be used primarily in the social sciences. A scholar practitioner might be a research psychologist who also works as a therapist, or a political scientist who is also a policy advisor. In this case, the scholarship and the practice might inform each other productively. As with the term public intellectual, an independent scholar might also be a scholar practitioner, but these are not the same thing. One can be an independent scholar without being a practitioner. I would also venture that one may be a scholar practitioner without being an independent scholar. The third term is scholar activist. Angela Davis comes to mind as a clear representative of this ideal, to the extent that she was both a trained academic and deeply involved in activist work. Martin Luther King Jr. is another obvious example. Again, being an independent scholar is not the same as being a scholar activist. Indeed, none of these terms capture precisely the same idea, and it's possible to be one or another or some combination without being the others. We might capture the possibilities by using a Venn diagram. I would suggest that what is distinctive about being an independent scholar lies in the qualifier independent. An independent scholar is one who possesses independence in several senses: institutional, intellectual, and financial. This notion of independence is related to the ideal of independence that the tenure system was allegedly designed to facilitate. What I am suggesting is that anyone can have that type of independence independently. Tenure, an endowed chair, a professorship, and an institution might be helpful, but they are unnecessary. In fact, my observation is that these frameworks just as often function as impedances to true scholarly independence. There are not a few scholars I admire who I believe could have done even better work had they removed themselves from the university system and chosen to work independently. So to my mind, an independent scholar is one who is dedicated to independence on all levels. To put it another way, independent scholarship is scholarship as the practice of freedom. It is taking on the practices of scholarship as a way of life, not in order to get a job or achieve renown, but in order to cultivate oneself on the deepest level possible. I said a moment ago that the independent scholar has three types of independence: institutional, intellectual, and financial. Those three forms of independence will be the subjects of the next 3 videos in this Independent Scholars Manifesto.